In our present day, the discipline of history lies in the academic realm, and maybe also to a very large extent it lies with Hollywood. But in the time of Joseph Scaliger, the discipline was predominantly ecclesiastical. History and chronology was for the most part written and edited by the clergy. Professor Anatoly Fomenko states that the ground-laying works of Scaliger and Petavius presents the ancient chronology as a table of dates given without any reasons whatsoever. This had been the ecclesiastical tradition which Scaliger and Petavius followed. So it would appear that the ecclesiastical tradition did not need to give reasons or sources, and the table of dates are to be interpreted as absolute truth. The modern-day method of source-based history seems to have been first introduced much later by Leopold von Ranke, building on the methods of the Göttingen school of history in the 18th and 19th century. Elias Bickerman states that Christian chronologists put secular chronography into service of ecclesiastical history, meaning the most important sources used in establishing the historical timeline were patristic. These are the works of the various church fathers. The church fathers were the early Christian theologians who shaped the intellectual doctrine and foundations of Christianity. The era in which they were active is known as the patristic era, which spans from the 1st century to the 8th century. The church fathers fall into three basic categories. The apostolic fathers, active during the age of apostles. They are believed to have either known the 12 apostles or have been significantly influenced by them. The ante-Nicene church fathers, active prior to the Council of Nicaea but after the age of apostles. The post-Nicene church fathers, active after the Council of Nicaea. And then a further distinction can be made between the Greek and Latin church fathers. Conventional history states that the foundations of chronology in the West were laid by the two church fathers Eusebius of Caesarea and Saint Jerome. This foundation is church history by Eusebius and the compilation of Saint Jerome in the alleged 4th century AD, or at least Joseph Scaliger's interpretation of the compilation of Saint Jerome and Eusebius. The compilation of Saint Jerome consisted of the following: the Vulgate, which was the Latin translation of the Bible; the Chronicon, which was the Latin translation, reworking, and continuation of the Chronicon of Eusebius. Keep in mind that the original Greek version of Eusebius was lost, and thus this Latin version was the primary vehicle of the material of Eusebius. This would have been the main source which Scaliger used to reconstruct the Chronicon of Eusebius. The Viris Illustribus, also called On Illustrious Men, which was a collection of short biographies of 135 illustrious men. This compilation became the standard and thus the foundation of chronological knowledge in the West. It is interesting to note that the church history by Eusebius, the remaining fragments of the Chronicon of Eusebius, and the Chronicon of Jerome weren't recovered until very late in the Middle Ages. It would appear that the chronologists had an absolute trust in their own interpretation of what ecclesiastical chronology was telling them. Deviation from this was almost considered a heresy. The Christian chronologists merged biblical and secular timelines, viewing all of history as part of a single divine narrative. A purposeful, God-directed plan, of which they themselves were the interpreters of. Scaliger, for instance, who was a devout Christian, could not conceive of such a heresy as running a fact check on the chronological material of the Church Fathers. So, trusting the authority of their predecessors unconditionally, or maybe their own authority, the chronologists reacted at external criticism in a bitter manner. It might actually be somewhat understandable how Scaliger had a blind faith in the work of the Church Fathers and his interpretation of it. Let's recall a few years ago when people who did not want to participate in a medical experiment were censored, coerced, and banned from work, media, and many areas of society, and were deemed heretics or radicals when they deviated from the dominant authoritarian narrative. So Joseph Scaliger, who belonged to the top echelon of society in an era where religious doctrine was far more dominant than today, may not have been able to see his own mistakes, and may have been very deep in his own cognitive dissonance, as we see so many people today are as well. According to Professor Anatoly Fomenko, the Scaligerian chronology of biblical books and manuscripts rests on the authority of chronologists and theologians of the era of the Reformation, when the question of biblical chronology and history became an essential weapon in the struggle between Catholic and Protestant camps, which swept the whole of Western Europe in the 16th and 17th century. These struggles are known as the European Wars of Religion. So one is to bear in mind that the chronology of the present day is largely based on the scholastic biblical chronology of the Middle Ages. Let us look at the earliest codexes of the Bible. The Codex of Mount Sinai. The Codex Sinaiticus was only discovered in the 19th century by Constantine von Tischendorf, a very interesting individual. It was then dated to the 3rd century AD paleographically. The Alexandrian Codex. The Codex Alexandrinus is known to have been given to the English King Charles I by the Patriarch Cyril Lucaris in 1628, another very interesting individual. It was dated to the 5th century, paleographically. The Vatican Codex. The least is known about Codex Vaticanus. It manifests in the Vatican magically around 1475 and has been dated to the 4th century AD, paleographically. So, the 3 oldest codexes of the Bible only surface after the 15th century. The reputation of their antiquity was created largely by the authority of Constantine von Tischendorf, as they were dated in the 19th century, paleographically. Keep in mind that the discipline of paleography was only established in 1680 by Jean Mabillon. This was decades after Scaliger chronology had already been established. Conventional history states that the biblical canon was agreed upon by the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, but no edicts of this council remain in existence. The biblical canon was really made official during the Council of Trent in 1545, during the era of the Reformation. It was during the Council of Trent that the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome was affirmed by the Catholic Church as the official Latin Bible, although there was no single standardized or authoritative edition of the Bible at that time in any language. The official edition to be released 3 decades later in 1590 was the 16 Vulgate. Another interesting fact is that the earliest known use of the term Vulgata to describe St. Jerome's new translation was made in the 13th century by Roger Bacon, a very interesting individual. It is also very relevant to know that a great many biblical books were banned and lost during the Council of Trent. For example, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judea were lost and considered apocryphal. The term apocrypha is an interesting one and has multiple meanings. The current one being that these are the biblical or related writings not forming part of the accepted canon or scripture, some of which might be of doubtful authorship or authenticity. Allegedly. The word apocryphal was first applied to writings that were to be read privately, rather than in the public context of church service, so it could have been considered information not intended for the uninitiated, or information which required to be hidden, as the Greek root of the word is related to hide or conceal. The interesting thing is that the meaning of doubtful authenticity regarding this term was recorded in the 16th century. This was the era when the Council of Trent took place and the era of the European wars of religion, after which the meanings of false or bad or heretical were attributed to the term apocryphal. It seems to me the meaning of the word was changed, and it seems to me this was done during the era of the Council of Trent.